we haven't talked. Ukraine is obviously very much on everybody's mind. I know you've focused a lot on this. Look, the Tories have been very, very solid on Ukraine under both Johnson. Liz Truss was the blink of an eye, but also under Sunak. Is Labour going to be as committed to continue to support Ukraine? And then Kim and Greg can also weigh in on this. Kim, particularly from the US perspective, especially with the prospect of a Donald Trump presidency, we don't even know what kind of the West's, NATO's Ukraine policy will really be. But just, Ian, quickly from you on,
yes.
will Labour keep up that approach?
Yes, it will be. And their shadow defence guy, who almost certainly be defence secretary, has been very committed on it. The problem that Labour will have is that it will look to Paris and to Berlin, and obviously the relationship between those two countries is dreadful at the moment between those two capitals. Simultaneously, French politics is kind of coming apart. So they'll try and have a go at being the country, making Britain the country that sort of solves that problem, which I think is not possible to solve. So fairly quickly, I think Labour will be, confronted with the reality that it's about American power. What happens if a Trump administration backs away from Ukraine in some way is a whole other question. That's Europe.
Well, so we got a whole other episode coming up on the US election, and Kim will weigh in a lot on that. I know, but just very briefly, Kim, on that. I mean, tell us what your assessment. You talk to Republicans a lot. I mean, will another a Trump administration and maybe a Republican-controlled Congress, is that going to be it for Ukraine support?
Well, I'm actually very worried about the UK and its continued support, because we don't know much about Keir Starmer, as Ian was saying, and his worldview. And I do feel that there's an element in Britain that has a similar dynamic to the US. I mean, the American Democratic Party has never been one that was at the forefront of intervention in foreign conflicts. In fact, they were the opposite. They have rallied behind Joe Biden in part because it's a contrast with Donald Trump, and because Joe Biden has felt that he needed to be a strong figurehead in all of this. Does that come apart if Donald Trump wins the election? He's been very vague in his own way. I mean, mostly he walks around and says, if I'd been president, none of this would have happened. And when I'm president, we'll solve it in a day. Well, that's a lovely sentiment, but how do you actually do that? And there is, I think, some real concern that, especially dealing with budgetary pressures in the United States, in addition to Donald Trump's worldview, that there is going to be a fallback and support for Ukraine. And I worry very much that without that, and especially with Europe and Germany suffering both of their own internal political problems, that the UK will be left a little twisting in the wind, and the compulsion might be to also step away.
And Greg, if I may, very briefly on this, because we are almost out of time, but we often hear the focus on Ukraine is very much a northern and western hemisphere obsession, and that the southern hemisphere, thinks rather differently. Again, whether it's the outcome of the UK election or the outcome of the US election, how much does what happened in Ukraine, how much does that resonate in the rest of the world?
So, Jerry, a huge question, but I'll just make two quick points. The first is we're fully on board with the UK and the US on Ukraine, but we don't give them anything very much that's useful, and we don't spend a lot of money. And so, like everything else, and with like all other Western governments, we want to do it on the cheap, and therefore we're not doing it very well. But we haven't done very well with the Global South. We haven't convinced the Global South to support us in a significant way on Ukraine. And the second point I'd make is that Keir Starmer, like Anthony Albanese in Australia, will have enormous difficulties with the Trump administration. In the previous Trump administration, we had Conservative Prime Ministers, Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison. And with Shinzo Abe and Benjamin Netanyahu, they were very, very good Trump whisperers. We got great results out of the Trump administration. Bilaterally, he was fine for us. He caused a lot of chaos elsewhere, but he did everything for us that we wanted him to do, and they were very dedicated Trump whisperers. Now, I just think it's much harder for a Labor leader with a party which will viscerally hate Trump to engage in the kind of, Shinzo Abe would manage to 5-putt from 3 feet out to make sure Trump won the golf round. It's just much harder for Labor leaders to do that, and Trump is going to be a big challenge for Keir Starmer if he should win, just as he will be a very big challenge for Anthony Albanese. And the anti-American elements of the British Labor Party and the Australian Labor Party will be very hard for moderate prime ministers to control, I should think.
Very good point. We're pretty well out of time, but I just want one quick round from each of you, brief questions, brief answers, if you would. Everybody has been talking about this year as a year of elections everywhere. Almost half the world, citizens of the world, population of the world, is voting this year. We've got this big election in the UK coming up, the big election later in the US. Leaders like to talk about what's at stake in these elections, and particularly over here in the US, we hear a lot about democracy being at stake. I always think democracy somehow is always at stake when the left elites lose. Apparently, when they win, apparently democracy is just fine. But Ian, from the UK perspective, as you look at these elections, I mean, how healthy does democracy look, and do these elections offer an opportunity to strengthen it?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean,
it's 10 seconds if you would. I'm kidding. No, I'm kidding. I'll give you a little bit longer, but briefly, if you would.
I think we're in serious trouble if, by quirk of the system, you end up with almost no opposition, and you end up in a situation where you have a Labour government which has a massive majority, a super majority, because of a split on the right. And I just think that's going to be very unhealthy. I mean, history shows us that governments that have those super majorities become arrogant and succumb to hubris and make terrible mistakes. And I think we're about to repeat that historical experience.
Kim, democracy on the ballot?
Everyone's talking about, this is such an important and such serious elections. I have the opposite view. I think that this is going to be a round of not serious elections because of the dynamics of what's going on. As Ethan was just saying, you have a Tory party that has so messed it up, and now you've got divisions among the right that is going to hand the Labour Party a victory, but for how long and what comes after. And similarly, Donald Trump, if he comes back to office, right now the United States is facing two candidates that most of the electorate do not want to have at the head of their party. And if Donald Trump should win, it's only 4 more years. If Joe Biden wins, it's only 4 more years. If he makes it those 4 years. And I still think that what's going to matter in elections are the next round and after some parties have had a shakeout and decided what they're actually going to be.
Greg, the plight of democracy, last word is on you.
Yeah, so in Britain, I think if Starmer wins very big, there'll be the problem of a lack of an opposition. But also, I think very quickly you'll get massive divisions within the Labor Party. The Labor Party itself is profoundly divided between social democrats and radicalised identity politics people and Palestinian activists and woke maniacs. And in the United States, I think Trump and Biden, neither of them is a bargain. I'd like to buy them at my estimate and sell them at their estimate. But what worries me more than those two individuals is this polarization of the legal system. So I do think the Trump trial in New York was a shocking abuse of process. And you're getting now Republican courts and Democrat courts, and the other half of the society won't accept the legitimacy of the courts. Now, that, oddly enough, that I think of everything that's happened in the United States in the last 5 or 6 years, that worries me more than anything else, and that takes the loss of trust in institutions to a whole new level.
Well, I wish we could talk more. We will have another opportunity to talk about the US election. We've touched on it a bit in this one, but for this one was focused on the British general election, which is on July the 4th, just a few weeks from now. And for all the talk and all the forecasts and all the expectations, and everybody knows what's going to happen, and the pundits always think they know the exact result. I always remember that there is always an element of uncertainty. In these circumstances, I always like to quote one of my favourite poems by G.K. Chesterton about the British people, which ends with the line, smile at us, pay us, passers, but do not quite forget, for we are the people of England, and we have not spoken yet. Well, they get that chance on July the 4th. But in the meantime, Ian Martin, thank you so much from the Times, Kim Strassel, the Wall Street Journal, Greg Sheridan, the Australian. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us.